Hello, I'm Dr. Maury Markman from City of Hope. And in this final segment of Minutes with Markman, where I wanted to sort of talk about older trials, I'd like to discuss two phase 3 randomized trials that were conducted actually years apart, but provide, I think, quite striking evidence of the impact of our therapies on outcomes after a patient has finished the trial, and why, in most cancers today, not all, PFS needs to be the endpoint of the study rather than overall survival because of what happens after a patient finishes the trial. So here's a scenario. I'm going to talk very briefly about two phase 3 randomized trials, both of which were of regulatory quality and regulatory quality control. In fact, because they were phase 3 trials sponsored by industry for regulatory approval. The drug combination I want to focus on in terms of the outcome was the combination of carboplatin plus gemcitabine, two standard of care chemotherapy drugs, which were being looked at in phase 3 randomized trial, again, for regulatory approval. In the first study, the carboplatin plus gemcitabine was actually the experimental arm to try to get the regimen approved by the FDA. And in the second study was actually the control arm, with the experimental arm being carboplatin, gemcitabine, and bevacizumab. But I don't want to talk about those other arms. We're talking specifically here about the impact of the carboplatin and gemcitabine. And these two trials, monitored very carefully for regulatory approval. And what happened to these patients in terms of how they did on the trial and then what happened afterwards. And again, separated by a number of years. I note, again, because it's critical, that cross-trial comparisons are fraught with great potential hazard because the patient populations may be different. Even though we say it's regulatory approval, even though we follow the criteria that are set up for eligibility and ineligibility, even though it's the same drugs and the same regimen, the populations may be very different, as I discussed on the previous segment of for the Markman, as related to the cisplatin paclitaxel experience. So, what is the justification for discussing these two regimens in these trials together? Well, here's the justification. When you look at the progression-free survival, median progression-free survival of the patients on the two studies separated by a number of years, in fact, the PFS of patients on the two regimens, again, the two regimens, same drugs, but different regimen separated by these number of years, carboplatin versus gemcitabine, the median PFS were essentially identical in the studies for the carboplatin gemcitabine, 8.4 and 8.6 months. Can't get closer than that. In other words, whoever the patients were on the study, whatever the eligibility criteria was, whatever the clinical characteristics, how long they've been off platinum, et cetera, whatever the comorbidities are that might have influenced whether they received therapy or not, the median PFS were essentially identical, which gives you some reassurance that the populations, the outcomes were similar. Yet, here's the point I'm trying to make. When you look at the overall survival outcomes for the patients who receive carboplatin plus gemcitabine in the earlier study versus the later study, we see striking differences. Again, I'm going to say again, the PFS for the regimens on the two studies were identical. But in the first study, the overall survival median was 18.0 months. But in the second study with the same regimen, same eligibility criteria, reported 6 years later, the median overall survival of that population was 35.2 months, almost a doubling of survival. PFS was the same, but overall survival almost doubled. Why? Well, of course, we don't know for sure. I can't prove what I'm going to say now. We didn't record, and we don't record, what happens over multiple months or years. But in fact, it is highly likely that the spectrum of available therapeutic options available to the patients treated in the later study was very different. Different drugs, radiation approaches, secondary surgeries, or other interventional options available over the later period of time that could have significantly extended survival, a very positive outcome. But this had nothing to do with the original drugs. This was happened after the patients went off the study. They had progressed. They were off the study, but they had the opportunity to live longer because of all of these other therapies, again, having nothing to do with that original regimen that they were on. This had to do with what happened after that. So that impacted their overall survival. And this is why it is so difficult to use overall survival as a primary study endpoint, because so much that happens in diseases that are now becoming more chronic. Median overall survival in this recurrent ovarian cancer study was 3 years. This was in the recurrent setting, median survival, 3 years. Lots can happen that had nothing to do with what they were on in terms of the trial. Very important point that absolutely helps address some of the debate today regarding appropriate primary endpoints of phase 3 randomized trials in cancer in general, and certainly in ovarian cancer. And I thank you very much for your attention.